greetings, fellow Earthlings, as I like to say, in honor of an old friend. Welcome to the second of System Change, Not Climate Change's 2020 series of webinars. Before we continue, let's take a collective moment to acknowledge, honor, and thank the indigenous or first peoples whose homelands we each occupy. Let's say their names to ourselves, or if we aren't sure, let's promise ourselves to learn. My name is Maura Stevens, and I'm honored to be the introducing SCNCC member for today's talk by author, deep thinker, and SCNCC founding member Richard Smith. Richard's book, China's Engine of Environmental Collapse, has recently been published by Pluto Books. I've just read it, and although I've been an environmental peace and justice activist for decades, it filled a lot of gaps in my own knowledge. Following Richard's 20-minute talk or so will be a discussion between Richard and Promise Lee, a socialist activist from Hong Kong and Los Angeles. I'm one of the more recently active members of System Change, Not Climate Change, an eco-socialist network, founded in 2013. I landed with SCNCC because I read its points of unity in many articles, and I felt at home. The points of unity start with these three sentences. The current ecological crisis results from the capitalist system, which takes profits for a global ruling elite over people and planet. It must therefore be confronted through an international mass movement of working people. We are for building a multiracial, multi-ethnic left, united against ecological destruction spawned by capitalism. You can read all the points of unity and learn more about eco-socialism at the website, systemchangenotclimatechange.org. If these resonate with you, please consider joining us. It's so easy to feel powerless and hopeless at this time of environmental, economic, and political systems collapse. We know at least 2 people who had pre-registered for today's event from places they found refuge after fleeing their own communities facing environmental catastrophe, one from hurricane-induced flooding and one from wildfires. We all know that capitalism has failed us, and it's the root cause of many of the ills we face. Environmental destruction, poverty, and the many isms. We believe we can find better ways, but not alone. Together we can face our fears and find our power in collective action, informed by knowledge such as that we'll gain today, and by love. A couple of housekeeping notes. Please mute your sound and keep it muted throughout. We'll keep the chat closed while Richard speaks for 20 minutes or so, and through the first 10 minutes or so of his conversation with Promise. After that, we'll open it up for you to send questions. Send them to the person who called himself Questions Here, which is our stalwart, Ted Franklin, a CNCC member. We've collected some questions in advance, and there won't be time to answer them all, I'm sure, but we'll do the best we can. So please keep them succinct. We are going to try and end it 15 minutes after the hour. Today's event will be recorded and it'll be posted on our website and Facebook page, or the links to it will be posted on our website. It'll be also available on the Facebook page, and you can watch live on Facebook right now. Please share the links with anyone who wasn't able to get on today, but and is interested in the subject matter. And please buy Richard's book. It's riveting and it's really an easy read. I couldn't put it down. You can buy it through plutobooks.com, and we'll post a link in the chat room. So thanks again for joining us. Here is Richard Smith speaking on China's engine of environmental collapse.
Thank you all for coming. Thank you for System Change. Thanks to System Change for hosting this. And okay, so I'm going to talk. I'll just give a kind of overview of the book for about 20 minutes, then we'll turn it over to Promise Lee and he can post some questions, and then we'll go to the audience for more questions. Okay, so this book began some years ago with a question: why is pollution so out of control in China? Let me just set my timer here. Okay. China's, for example, China's CO2 emissions are more than double those of the US, with the GDP just 63% as large in 2017. In 2018, its emissions were nearly equal to the emissions of those of the next 5 largest emitters, the US, India, Russia, Japan, and Germany combined. Yet China's population is at least 68% as large, and its GDP just 32% as large as those countries combined. Moreover, developed world emissions have been declining. The US emissions have declined from their peak in 2007, and EU emissions have trended downward for 3 decades. Japan's dropped 13% since 2013, by this year. To be sure, those declines are not enough to stop global warming and not even enough to meet their Paris pledges, but at least they're declines. By contrast, China's emissions have relentlessly grown, quadrupling between 1900 and 2017, then growing another 4% per year since then. As the world's largest emitter, accounting for 30% of the total global emissions, against 15% for the US, 9% for EU 28, 7% for India, 5% for Russia, and 4% for China, for Japan, that makes China by far the leading driver of global warming, and thus, in effect, the leading driver of climate collapse. Well, why is that? In 2017, when President Trump announced that the US would withdraw from the Paris Agreement, Xi Jinping, the president of China, termed it a hard-won achievement that all signatories must stick to. Walking away from that pact would endanger future generations, he said. And yet that's exactly what he's done. Instead of prioritizing clean energy, Xi's government has slashed funding for wind and solar power in the last couple of years, while ramping up spending on new coal-fired power plants. This prompted related questions. Why do China's state-owned industries produce steel and aluminum they can't sell? It gets dumped on the world market at a loss or piles up in stockyards. Why build more coal-fired power plants when it's already got too many and they're running at half speed? Why build new high-speed trains that run empty, or subways in small towns and empty airports and empty highways? Why is there so much over-construction, empty blocks of apartments like in Wuhan that got blown up and then demolished to start all over again? Why build skyscrapers and ghost cities with no tenants and no prospective residents? Right now, the country is in plan, producing 3.4 billion residences for under construction and planning for a country with 1.4 billion people. So why is that? And why is corruption so out of control? After all, it's often argued in the West, like in the Economist magazine, the Wall Street Journal, and so forth, that China's dictatorship ought to be an advantage. It should be able to compel producers to stop or else. Xi should be able to ram through the transition to renewables and stop corruption in its tracks. So why don't they do these things? In my book, I try to answer these questions by constructing a Marxist mode of production theorization of China's political economy. I contend that China is a hybrid, bureaucratic, collectivist, capitalist economy. Roughly speaking, it's a tripartite economy. About 50% of the economy is state-owned, state-planned. About 30% is a joint venture, mostly capitalist economy in the archipelago of special economic zones along the coast and elsewhere in interior China too. And about 20% of the economy is the private economy. This book is concerned mostly with the state sector, except the first chapter, which is about the special economic zones, the capitalist sector. The rest is concerned with the state sector because it's the biggest, it's the most important part of the economy. It overdetermines the rest, and it exemplifies the irrationalities and pollution problems just noted, plus a lot of others. I argue here, I propose this argument here, that China's bureaucratic rulers are driven by 3 imperatives that are at least as powerful, if not more powerful, drivers of hypergrowth than profit maximization under capitalism. First, they must maximize economic growth and self-sufficient industrialization. Why? Because as a state-based ruling class, they're not based on enterprises or investments in the world economy. They're a state-based ruling class in a nation, in a world dominated by more advanced capitalist economies and societies. Mao and his successors understood like Khrushchev and Stalin before him in the Soviet Union, that they must catch up and overtake the United States, build a relatively self-sufficient high-tech superpower economy shielded from Western takeover, and so on. The Soviets' failure to win the economic arms race with the US, economics and arms race with the US, doomed the Communist Party. Mao and his successors, Deng Xiaoping, and those following him, notably Xi Jinping, have been determined to avoid that error. Secondly, they need to maximize employment. In capitalist economies, employers have no obligation to the unemployed. If workers are laid off, it's not the capitalist problem. It's not even the government's problem, except in severe downturns like the Depression, when they could face unrest. But because the Communist Party was in fact once a workers' party, it can't completely ignore the workers, since the government has to support them in the end anyway, whether even if it's just what the Chinese call the dibao, which is the minimum subsistence payment. It's better to have them producing something than just milling about and probably making trouble. That's why the government seeks to keep them busy, by generating jobs. 5-year plans regularly include job creation targets. Yet keeping China's hundreds of millions of workers working, producing something ends up meaning producing superfluous steel, needless infrastructure, ghost cities, and so on. Maximizing employment is a major driver of overproduction, overconstruction, and profligate waste of energy and resources across the economy, and the pollution that flows from them. Thirdly, they must seek to maximize consumption and consumerism. In the wake of the collapse of this Soviet Communist Party in 1991, the Chinese Communist Party's own near-death experience with the Tiananmen protests in 1989, the party leadership resolved to create a kind of mass consumer society and raise incomes in order to focus people's attention on consumption and take their minds off politics. So those are the main drivers emanating from Beijing. And there are other drivers. In my book, I describe all the drivers from local provinces, municipalities, local governments, and so on, how they stand to gain by generating more growth. Okay, this book then discusses the contradictions and barriers built into the system, barriers to environmental reform. For example, why Xi can't rein in his polluters. And the reason there, the central reason there, I contend, is that because they're not employees like under capitalism, they can't generally be fired. They're members of the same party bureaucratic ruling class as Xi Jinping, and so they can, if they have good bases and good with the connections, what the Chinese call guanxi connections. If they have good relations with higher ups and down below, they can defy Beijing with impunity when it suits their economic interests to keep polluting but profitable factories going. Secondly, why then why, on the other hand, Xi Jinping doesn't really try very hard to suppress pollution for all his ecological civilization talk and so forth. His overriding priority is to maximize growth, build up state-owned industrial champions, to overtake the US. To get there, he has to prioritize hypergrowth over the environment and let the polluters pollute, even if this ends in climate collapse. Of course, Western capitalist economies led by the US are racing China to the brink of climate collapse too. And likewise, they can't prioritize people over planet either. But what's uniquely dangerous about the Chinese case is first, that its emissions are so huge, nearly a third of total global emissions, and growing so fast that scientists tell us they could eventually even doom the climate on their own, kind of pretty much regardless of what the rest of the world does. And secondly, while we in the West still have the freedom to mobilize and fight our governments and companies whose emissions threaten our survival, and our collective actions have in fact restrained, if far from enough, the growth of emissions in the US and Europe and so forth. By contrast, the Communist Party runs a police state that ruthlessly suppresses all resistance. Given Xi's great firewall, most Chinese have no idea that China's emissions are so huge. And there's no discussion of the concept of overproduction's impact on the planet in China. It's just not, you just don't read or see anything like this. And even if they did, because it's such a fearsome state, they can't resist. So what to do? Well, in the conclusion, I argue that the only solution for China, as for the US and other industrialized nations, is to grab the emergency brake, declare a climate emergency, suppress production, shut down, phase out, retrench fossil fuel-based industries around the world, significantly deindustrialize. In China's case, that would mean shutting down the all but essential coal-fired power plants, and shut down the auto industry and abolish disposable industries, and shut down all but essential aviation and construction, and create a public works program for those displaced workers, and initiated an environmental restoration program, and many other things. Of course, all of this would require a social revolution to eco-socialism in China and the US, and any such revolution seems just completely impossible in either case. Yet I end the book on what I think is a kind of realistic if cautiously optimistic note. The CCP, the Communist Party, can't last forever. It's facing insoluble contradictions that its standard answer for everything, growth, is just making its problems worse. It faces growing opposition both in China and beyond, even though it's not so visible at the moment, although except in Hong Kong. And the party itself is fracturing, as the expulsion of Tsai Xia, a professor at the party school last week, demonstrates. It faces growing resistance in Tibet, in Xinjiang, and in Inner Mongolia too. So I think that these problems are insoluble. In the end, the Communist Party is going into the dustbin of history. Hopefully we'll have time to discuss these issues a bit. I'm going to stop right there earlier than I planned, because I want to take up so many questions that people have raised. Okay, thank you.
I guess I'll jump in here, right? Okay.
Jump in here now.
Can folks hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Great. Yeah, thanks for that presentation and echoing what Maura said. Really amazing and very accessible book that reminds us very clearly of the stakes of what it means to talk about the ecological crisis and in the context of China. So thank you for that presentation again. And for this wonderful book. And I also look forward to the other questions posed later too from everyone else. The first question I want to begin with is, something that I think Richard already kind of alluded to in the beginning of the talk, that was extended in a recent kind of exchange on Spectre. Richard writes that China's system isn't entirely capitalist, but is a kind of hybrid bureaucratic collectivist capitalist economy. And this is something you expand on in a recent response to Eli Friedman on Spectre magazine. Can you say more about this distinction and talk more about why this distinction is important for your readers, especially in light of China's ecological problem?
Well, we have two systems racing each other off the cliff to collapse here, and they're both driven by growth imperatives that are similar but different. The Chinese imperatives are not necessarily profit. Not in the state industrial sector anyway. Its concern is to maximize the wealth and power, the security of the Communist Party. It's not to maximize profit. Whereas in capitalism, the standard impetus, the standard driver is profit maximization. So what difference does it make? In the end, maybe perhaps not much, except that in the short run, because it's a police state, it makes it possible for the system to maintain this level of pollution without either its people knowing much about it or being able to do anything about it. So it's very hard to organize against this. That's, I guess, maybe the biggest thing. I don't know, Promise. You have any thoughts on this?
Yeah, I think this is something I'm still thinking about, but I thought, yeah, I think actually, I'd also appreciate if there's some sort of exchange between different people who have different opinions on this matter, on the capitalist question, whether China is capitalist, and the type of responses that would generate, like the type of exchange that was at Spectre. So I don't have a particular response.
Well, there's lots of, as I said in the Spectre article, there's lots of capitalism in China. There's gangster capitalism, there's state capitalism, there's regular capitalism, there's crony capitalism, there's all that. And there, you know, there are more billionaires in China than in the US. And most workers in China work in the private sectors. That said, it's still, the private sector is not the dominant share of the economy. The state sector and all the commanding heights are all controlled by the state. And the state even controls lots of mundane, ordinary consumer industries like beverages and food and real estate and construction and all kinds of industries that are not critical, essential, like telecoms or banks or steel or high-tech industries and so forth, which are pretty much all state-owned. But even the companies that are not state-owned, like Huawei, for example, you know, Huawei maintains it's a privately owned company owned by its employees. But some researchers did a little investigation there. They tried to find out who it was owned by, and they concluded they really couldn't find out because it was completely secret. But what was clear, it wasn't owned. What was clear is it certainly wasn't owned by its employees. So it's, you know, widely assumed to be funded by the state and backed up by the state. It's basically like a state, you know, dependent industry. And all these big industries in China, Alibaba, these companies have big monopolies, large monopolies or near monopolies that are guaranteed backed up by the state. So they're able to become huge and very profitable industries. But they're in China. They don't work so well out of China. We'll see. Anyway, so there is a substantial capitalist sector in China, but as I recalled, the Chinese capitalist class has been suborned. It's been subordinated to the state, and Xi Jinping began arresting these guys in 2017. He began taking them down, even before then, but in 2017 he began taking down some really big ones, like from HNA and Bang Insurance and all these big capitalists who'd invested in the world market and bought real estate in New York and hotels and this, that, and the other. Anyway, he recalled them all and told them he wants their investments concentrated in state priorities, not on trivial projects and real estate and sports teams and whatnot, so outside the country. So he forced them to divest. He mostly nationalized them and forced them to divest their holdings. So there is plenty of capitalism in China, but it's the Chinese Communist Party keeps them on a short leash.
Yeah, I mean, I just want to kind of, you know, invite you to talk a bit more about the state-owned companies part. I think a certain section in your book talked about how, right, like given like what you just said about the prioritization of these kind of state-owned firms, and how, especially in the past, in the last couple of decades, the Chinese government has actively not let some of these state-owned companies go bankrupt, or there's kind of a specific drive to keep these companies going even though it's not profitable. And I think, you know, it's a very foreign dynamic for what's going on in the United States, I think, in a lot of ways. And yeah, I wonder if you want to expand a little bit on what that whole dynamic means or what's going on there too.
Right. Well, what's going on is that, you know, ever since the 1990s, ever since the 1980s, really, so these Western economists like Paul Krugman and so forth, and before that Milton Friedman and all, they're always lecturing to the Communist Party saying, well, what you people have to do is you have to let your zombies fail. You need to let them go bankrupt. And then they'll be succeeded by newer, more profitable, more efficient companies and so forth. And so, you know, I have this great quote from Paul Krugman, who said in 2015, when the state came to the rescue of the economy and didn't let their companies go bankrupt in the crisis that August. He had this great column entitled, the title slips me I forget the exact title, but it's something about the zombies. Anyway, they just, you know, these people, these Western economists, they can't think outside the capitalist box. So they don't understand why it makes complete sense from the Communist Party's point of view to maintain and grow an industry that's not particularly efficient. They want to have their own industry. It would be, you know, it's true from a capitalist point of view that if the Chinese Communist Party let its it's major steel companies that are very inefficient, or it's rail company, for example, like Chinese railroads, build all these high-speed trains and so forth. It's completely bankrupt, as I explained in that article in Spectre. It's completely broke. It's been broke for years. It's building many railroads all over the country that don't make any money. There are lots of lines. There's some very good lines, like the line between Beijing and Shanghai, which I've taken. It's a very great line. It's very crowded. It's always crowded. But there are lots of lines out there that have like a half dozen passengers in a car. They go to little towns and so forth all over the place. So it's a very to keep building these things is profitable till you get the subsidy for the local officials to get subsidies from the central government for this, but it's not necessarily profitable in a capitalist criteria. So the Western economists tell them, you should just let these companies go bankrupt, and they'll be succeeded by newer, better, more efficient, more profitable companies. But the problem is that the state needs a certain kind of industrial structure. It doesn't want its companies to be taken over by more efficient Western companies. They've been there, done that already in the 1930s and 40s. They want to have their own companies, even if they're not as efficient as a Western company. They don't care. I'm sure Citibank could run a more efficient bank than the Bank of China, maybe, but they're not interested in having Citibank take over their banking, thank you very much. So they keep the Bank of China going. And maybe their railroad could be succeeded by some more efficient European high-speed rail. Maybe so, I don't know. But they're not interested in letting that happen. So they want to maintain their own companies. That's the first thing, because they need to build these champions. They want to build an industrial structure that it has the complete suite of industries. It has all the high technology industries, the same as in the US. And it wants those to be companies that it owns and controls. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that you have many imperatives from below by the local officials who run those, the local operations of those companies to keep people employed. And so it makes sense to keep those companies going. So I quote I'm writing another book on China, which is, it takes up this in a different way. It's about the nature of the revolution and so forth. But I have some chapters in there where I talk about these local officials who say, well, look, you want us to be efficient, but if I'm efficient, I'm going to throw these people out of work. And what's that going to help? Because I'll still have to support them in the end. Our government will still have to pay their unemployment, and you lose the production. So in the end, it makes more sense for the state to let these guys keep producing and keep these people employed than it does to close them down and be efficient in a capitalist sense. So the systems have different internal economic rationalities. It makes sense in the Chinese context for the state to build up, for example, it wants to build its own jetliner, right? In fact, it will cost it more to produce its own jetliner to compete with Boeing and Airbus Industries. It'll cost them more to produce those planes than it would to just simply buy them from Boeing or Airbus Industries. And in a capitalist rational world economy, everybody would buy the cheapest, most efficient producer's product, right? That's why, other countries don't try to manufacture airliners. They just buy them from Boeing or Airbus Industries. But in China's case, they don't want that money going out of the economy, where they want to build their own airlines that they can control completely, the whole technology and so forth. So it makes sense, even if it's a second best plane, even if it's more expensive to produce, it's their plane and their industry, and they create it. So you can see that rationality throughout the economy. It makes sense. Sometimes it's the best, but if it's not the best, it doesn't matter. It's their industry, and that's what they want. So that's the rationality of a bureaucratic economy. It's completely different than a bureaucratic collectivist economy, completely different than a capitalist rationality. These people are nationalists. They're not capitalists. They're not, I'm talking about the state industry. They're not capitalists. They're nationalists. And they want to build a national economy that has this whole suite of high-tech industry. So that's the Made in China 2025 program of Xi Jinping and so forth. So I think that those are the central differences. They have an internal rationality and set of drivers that are different from capitalism. And that explains the different trajectories of economic development in China versus the West.
Right, thanks for that. I'll just shift gears slightly too, and kind of refer to something I feel like is a kind of a sentiment I've heard a lot in the Western left and progressives, where people recognize or admit the fact that China has been responsible for a lot of the emissions and a lot of this kind of climate change problem. But then people see news here and there, right? Of like, at least they're spending more energy and resources on renewable energy sources and other types of kind of green friendly policies and stuff like that, right? And this is a report that I think, Richard, you just sent me a couple of days ago on from Global Energy Monitor that actually shows, right, the opposite of this type of effect, that China has 250 gigawatts of new coal power plants in construction and planning. And that's actually more than a 20% increase from last year, an amount that's larger than entire coal fleets of the US and India. And in the same kind of equation, China is also defunding or not having enough in terms of the solar and wind energy stuff, and ramping up still on coal-fired power plants. While at the same time, there already is kind of an excess amount of coal-fired capacity. While solar and wind investments continue to trail way behind because of poor planning and grid construction, as you point out in your book. Can you go more into that, and why still kind of ramp up on that coal-fired capacity thing? I think you mentioned this kind of rationale calculus of profit maximization that's kind of intrinsic to China's growth plan. Can you expand more on that aspect of things and dispel some of these kind of myths, right?
Yeah, happy to. With this issue, there are certain things about China's economy that are different from capitalism, and there are certain things that are similar. So, with the issue of it's ironic. What's so ironic about China is that it leads the world in the production of solar panels, photovoltaic panels, by far. It produces like 30% of the world, or more than that, of the world's solar panels. It dominates the world market. It also leads in the production of windmills. And it's got more installed capacity of both of those in China than the rest of the world almost together. So the question is, yet at the same time, it's maximizing the growth of coal industry. And yet, Xi Jinping swore, I mean, they promised in 2015 at the Paris climate agreement talks to reduce the reliance on coal and sharply boost the reliance on renewable energy. So why are they backtracking? Well, there are two sets of reasons. First of all, in China's political economy, it's very compartmentalized by provinces, by municipalities, counties. Everybody, from the days of Mao, the economy everybody tried to be as self-sufficient as possible in the old planned economy. And that was because they couldn't depend on getting the inputs they needed from outside their local bailiwick. And so they tried to produce it completely. So they had factories that were like, Ford's factory back in the 1910s, like you pour in raw materials at one end, you get everything out of the other end. And so they tried to be all inclusive, small and all inclusive and big and all inclusive. That's what they called it in China. And to a certain extent, that's for all the marketization of the last 40 years, that still prevails over much of the economy. So like you don't have an integrated market across the economy for energy. People don't trade energy between provinces and so forth. And so the renewable energy, the wind and solar, are for the most part concentrated in the West and the North and so for areas away from the East Coast. Where the wind is better and the sun is brighter and so forth. And so that's where you have a lot of these renewable energy plants. But the high demand for power in China is in the coastal, industrial, and big urban conglomerations. But the problem is, the planners said, okay, so we'll build these plants out there and then we'll connect them with big high power transmission lines. And they did that, and China leads the world in these high power transmission lines. The problem is that local officials in the East Coast said, no, we don't want that power from Xinjiang or Tibet or whatever. We don't want that power. We want to keep our own coal-fired power plants here. And why is that? Well, because that power, first of all, and this is a problem related to renewable energy everywhere, which is that it's intermittent. You can't depend on it 24/7. You need backup, some kind of backup. But since in China, the local power grids tend to be localized, people can't trade power and get power back and forth from other next door neighbor provinces and so forth. So it's very hard. They don't want to be dependent on suppliers way out in the West. They want to be dependent on what they have in their own place. So you find many factories have their own power plants. And there are millions of small power plants all over China. So it makes sense because these guys can control that. They have it, coal is pretty much available everywhere and you hear train loads of it coming. So, they can get coal anyway. So and the coal, you can burn the coal 24/7. You don't have to worry about power outages or anything like that. So coal is a very reliable, and that's the same problem in Japan or in Europe, the US or so forth. Now, in those countries, they do have an integrated power market. So as I explained in a chapter in my book, Canada and the US trade electricity across borders so that they can even out the unevenness and intermittency of solar and wind power. They trade it back and forth to compensate. But in China, there's no such market for that. Local authorities, local officials demand that they have a certain quota for energy generation in their bailiwick, and therefore they have work for their employees, so that they'll demand that that their coal-fired power plant gets to produce electricity a certain number of days or hours per day in a month or a year. And so they're able to do that. And even if the solar power comes in cheaper or it's available, they don't use it. So the problem is there's this tendency, this built-in tendency from the old Mao day economy of particularization, compartmentalization that influences the distribution of electricity in the system. So it makes it very hard for this system to be flexible and adapt to intermittency. And so what has happened is that they built up enormous, big arrays of solar power and windmills and so forth like that, but they're not being used to their maximum efficiency. There's a lot of downtime on them because they're not getting the demand from the East Coast that they would like. And so they stopped. So since she could not overcome this problem in recent years, like 2016, 17, 18, they couldn't overcome this problem. They quit building solar power plants and windmill plants. They just put it on ice, and they took funding away from, because they said, well, they're just as efficient. We don't need to subsidize them anymore. Well, but market efficiency price efficiency is not what controls electricity distribution in China. It's bureaucratic arrangements that control it. And so they quit building these power plants, and instead he's been ramping up coal-fired power. They've just put massive investments in coal in the last few years. In this article that I sent to Thomas from Bloomberg yesterday, or a day before yesterday, was about, I'm sorry, it's not from Bloomberg originally. Bloomberg took it from the Center for Energy and Energy, what's that guy's company name now? Center for Research on Energy and Clean Air. It's this guy, Laurie Milaverta. He used to be the lead climate researcher, energy researcher in Greenpeace in Beijing, but now he's got his own company. Anyway, so he showed that he does a lot of research on coal in China and solar and wind. And so he showed that in this year, they just have a huge burst of coal. They've been building up the last couple of years, but this year they just went over the top. They're building more coal-fired power plants this year, in the first 6 months of this year, than they built in all of 2018 and 19. And the amount they build are equal to, as big as all of the entire coal fleet of the United States or India, just in the first 6 months, just new construction of new power plants. And the power plant, it's not like they need these. Already there's 400% overcapacity of power plants, of coal-fired power plants in China, and they all run at like, you know, a third speed or half speed or something like that. But, you know, again, because it's a compartmentalized economy, it makes sense for local officials to run these plants, even if they only run at part-time speed, because they can gain from this. Whereas if they were to combine their small plants into bigger, more efficient plants that are more, you know, not so localized, but in centralizing more ideal locations and bigger power plants and distribute to all across the provinces or municipalities, then that would be more efficient in a capitalist sense, but not in a bureaucratic rationalist sense. So they don't do it. So they just they prefer to produce more and more coal-fired power plants that run at half speed, and that's rational in their system. So that's why they're doing that. But of course, you know, we're not seeing what the emissions are going to be this year yet, but they're going to be just huge. I mean, this is so crazy. So that's the problem. You know, the drivers here of this system are really intense for maximum growth and maximum pollution, and there's just hardly anything to do about it. And I was shocked about this, you know, Thursday, I don't think I mentioned this to Frank. Thursday, Gutierrez, the president of the, what's his office title, the head of the UN, it was at a conference in India, and he called on the UN to, he called on India to stop investing in coal-fired power and start putting resources into renewable energy. And that's great. And they really should do that. But why did he single out India for this? Because India's emissions are only 7% of global emissions, whereas China's emissions are 30% of China's global emissions. But I don't hear Gutierrez or even Trump or Greta Thunberg complaining about China's emissions. The world really needs a big campaign to bring to the attention the fact of China's huge, out of control emissions and do something about this. You know, pressure needs to be put on China to do something to bring in these emissions because they're just really off the charts.
Yeah, thanks for that again. I'll just end with kind of one more general broad question that maybe I'm sure folks will expand on after this section too, but is the status of kind of China's quote unquote imperialism, right? And that's been a big kind of debate raging in the left. Like, is China imperialist? What kind of imperialist is it? So I'm just posing a question to you as my last question. How does your analysis of the climate crisis in China shape your view of whether China is imperialist? More specifically, what kind of imperialism, and how does it differ from its more classical capitalist forms in the West? And what are the kind of main drivers of this growth?
That's a big question. Okay, China is imperialist. There's no doubt, but it's different than capitalism. They have a need. China, you know, like Western capitalism, like imperialism, like regular economy within any particular capitalist economy is driven by profit maximization. But the Chinese are not so. They want to make profit when they can, but they're more concerned about making influence, winning friends, and building up an alliance of mostly developing countries against the United States. And so it's willing to sacrifice, make loans that it knows it won't get back, fully repaid, and so on and so forth. So it does that. So that's its kind of that's its kind of outreach in that sense. It's why it's got its New Silk Road, Belt and Road initiative to build links to Europe and across Asia, and to build all kinds of train lines and power lines and whatnot across South Asia to Pakistan and so forth, and across in Africa. So it wants to build influence and win friends. That's the main goal of Chinese imperialism in the third world, I would say, and in the first world too. I mean, in the West too. It's more important for them to win influence and so forth than to make profits in purely capitalist sense. At home, you see this in the case of Tibet, Xinjiang, and most recently Inner Mongolia. The Chinese government, this is a more complicated history here, but the Communist Party are Han nationalists. And they have been since the days that Mao took over the party in the 1930s and 40s. Though, I mean, Mao, when he took over the party and they conquered Tibet right away, you know, they, in Xinjiang and Inner Mongolia, they subordinated those people to those minorities, so-called minorities, to those countries as colonies, basically, of China. And it keeps them tight. But this is hard for them to do. You know, they're really animated by a kind of vision of Han's superiority and cultural superiority that's very deep and goes back, you know, lots of countries are racist, like America, you know, did the same thing with the Indians and so forth, just exterminated them and stole their whole continent, you know. The Chinese are nowhere near as racist as the Americans are, but still, it is racism and it is Han imperialism. And they do, they have taken, you know, they push awful policies in those countries, setting up concentration camps in Xinjiang and so forth. But there's resistance. It's very interesting, just to read the last few days, there's resistance to the Communist Party has announced a big push to wage a campaign of a political campaign in Tibet against splitism. And so that means that, what that means is that after 70 years, they're really worried, after 70 years of ruling Tibet, they're worried about, they haven't conquered Tibet yet, intellectually, mentally. They have not spiritually, they have not taken over. They're really still fighting against the Tibetan culture and its religion and Buddhism and so forth. So they're waging a big campaign, launching a big campaign against that. And secondly, it just was announced a couple of days ago that I'll read you a little bit from this. This is very interesting. There's a massive civil disobedience breaks out and tensions. This is from oh, I don't have the text. Anyway, it's in Mongolia. This is the human rights organization in Mongolia. It says, I just got this last day, after the Chinese Chinese central government secret plan to replace Mongolian with Chinese as a language of instruction in all schools across southern Mongolia starting this September, in the name of a second type of bilingual education, was revealed in documents leaked from the local education authorities. A region-wide civil disobedience resistant movement has broken out in southern Mongolia, from kindergartners to top intellectuals, from middle schoolers to college students, from ordinary herders to rural villages, from businessmen and even to some government officials. People from all walks of life in southern Mongolia are standing up and in an unprecedented level of solidarity and coordination against the new policy, which many see as a new round of cultural genocide. In school, one kid said, the teachers went to school and they were so impressed. They were there at 8 o'clock, 9 o'clock, 10 o'clock. Nobody came. No parents showed up. No children came. We did it, a Mongolian teacher said, who lived by about their strike. Teacher strikes are widespread. And so he quotes a little kid. It says, who's, let's see, how old? 4 or 5. She said, I would rather stay home and herd my cattle than go to a Chinese school. Another girl, age 4 or 5, said in a video statement. There are a lot of videos about southern Mongolia on YouTube. This was just published a couple of days ago. So there's a lot of resistance in Tibet, in Xinjiang, and in Mongolia. So I think these are some big problems the Communist Party faces.
Great.
Wow.
I'll pass it back to Maura. Right. Good.
Thank you, Promise. Boy, this is such a fascinating discussion. I wish we had longer, but we've got another 25 minutes or so. And we have quite a few questions already, Richard, for you. They're going to come in no particular order. You've touched on some of these already, but everybody seems to want elaboration, especially on this one question. We have an activist audience, I think. So this has come up a lot. This is really in three parts. The first from Bill Balderston in Oakland, the second from Ted Franklin in the Bay Area, and the third from Jenny Chan in Hong Kong. So they're intertwined. But despite, you just touched on this a little bit, but we'll start out with, despite the repressive nature of the Chinese state, there has been a wide range of resistance around polluting development and labor rights. Is there hope for coalescing of these forces to assert political power? And Ted wants you to say more about opposition within China. Is there an Al Gore or a Bill McKibben or an AOC or Greta Thunberg or a system change, not climate change, any kind of organization like that? And from Jenny, the state can make a blue sky when it wishes, like the 2008 Beijing Olympic Games, a showcase of China's success to the world, but the state is not a strong ally. What do you think about the role of environmental activists and civil society in China? So they're all intertwined.
Okay, just to Jenny's question, as for a little bit to the other one first. I'm not on the ground in China, so I don't know. Jenny would know better than me. Jenny knows a lot about labor struggles in China. She's written a whole book about this, about Foxconn, workers in Foxconn, and I relied on her work in my own book. But it's a totalitarian police state. People can't speak up, they can't organize, they can't do anything freely. So what tends to happen is you have social explosions. Just all of a sudden things break loose, and then all of a sudden new leaders and people you never heard of come to the fore. And so that's what happens it happened in East Europe and after the wall fell and so forth. And it will happen in China when the government falls there too. But in the meantime, it's almost impossible to know. I mean, unfortunately in China, you don't have a situation like in Poland in the 1950s and 60s when CORE, the Committee of Labor Organization, underground intellectuals were able to organize despite the totalitarian state and make it effective. They were basically built Solidarność in Poland in 1980, 81. And they were the precursors, they radicalized, they were Marxists, they were socialists, anti-Stalinists, and they were able to have a big impact on that initial upheaval. Never mind that it didn't succeed in the end, but still, So, but in China, you can't do that. There's just no possibility anymore. Xi Jinping has just shut down everybody. I mean, shut down the NGOs. There used to be labor, right, Jenny? There used to be labor resource centers in Guangdong and so forth, and they've been shut down. Unionization efforts, the JASIC workers in 2018, the pictures I have from Jenny in my book about the JASIC workers and student organizers were all arrested. Students haven't been heard from since. So it's very difficult to know. And of course, there were the environmentalists. All the NGOs have been shut down. The environmentalists have been shut down. Greenpeace is still functioning in Beijing, and some others are, but it's very difficult. They have to be very careful what they do and say. So there's not much room for organizing. That said, there are signs of tremendous disenchantment, unhappiness with Xi Jinping. And I would call attention to the article by Chris Buckley in the New York Times a few days ago. Scathing criticism of Xi gets Communist insider expelled from the party. This woman, Sai Xia, who was a who was a professor in the party school, the Central Party school. She just attacked Xi Jinping as a totalitarian dictator. And he said, "You're forcing the Western countries into a showdown with us, and you're driving the world against us, making the whole world an enemy of China." The fact that she could say this, these sorts of things, and she wrote a bunch of essays and got away with it. The fact that she could say this sort of thing, and she was not shut up right away, shows that there are divisions in the ruling class. There are people support her, and she says it. She said that many people in the party feel like I do. So the question is, at some point, I think what's going to happen. At some point, something's going to happen, and they're going to get the hook, and they're going to take Xi Jinping off the stage. Now, whether they'll replace him with some kind of moderate communist or the whole party will collapse and so forth, that's hard to say. But as I said in the last chapter of my book, it's very hard to say. I mean, I'm for revolution, hanging on the wall for the lamppost, but that's probably not going to happen. But and there have been in Asia alone, the dictatorships have fallen peacefully, and the Kuomintang was peacefully voted out of power in Taiwan, and there's a democratic capitalist government in Taiwan, which is very supportive of the Hong Kong democracy movement. In South Korea, the dictatorship was overthrown peacefully and replaced with a democracy. You can complain about these democracies; they're better or worse than our crappy democracy, but at least they're democracies, And in East Europe, all those regimes fell without much bloodshed, except in Romania. So it's hard to say, what could happen. But the communists, my feeling is the Communist Party's crises are just too deep. It can't overcome them. And there is opposition within the party by people like her. There are oppositionists like Xu Zhiyong and Xu Zhangrun, intellectuals who've written scathing denunciations of Xi Jinping publicly. I mean, got the way to publish this stuff on the web. And the one by Xu Zhangrun, his stuff just, he goes essay after essay after essay. They're really, really great. And I recommend people go to China Heritage, a website from New Zealand. Jeremy his website, he's a great translator, and he's got a huge collection of all of this stuff. So there's a lot of dissident literature and a lot of dissident essays and so forth being written and published, and these people get taken down. Xu got arrested. He was fired from the university. He was a law professor. He was fired from the university and pension taken away and so forth. But he's not worried. They let him out. They let him out after a while. They didn't lock him up forever. They locked him up for a couple of weeks. So there are a lot of people waiting in the wings here. When something happens that brings down Xi Jinping, there will be a lot of other forces. Now, that could be bad. We could get fascism in China or something instead of democracy. Who knows? But I kind of think not. I try to be as optimistic as I can here about this. Okay.
Hard to be an optimist in these times, no matter where you are. We have a lot of interest in the US role, and one of them is, please name the most guilty US corporations who are doing business using slave labor and environmental degradation. You mentioned a lot of textile and other ones in your book. Can you elaborate on that, please?
Oh, there are just too many corporations to name. I mean, just hundreds of US corporations involved in one way or another, I did mention in my book one former presidential candidate from Utah. What's his name? Bain Capital, his company. His company Bain Capital was instrumental in setting up the first surveillance technology that helped the Chinese get a leg up on surveilling their people. You know, and this guy's an ardent anti-capitalist, so it's kind of interesting that he personally should do this. Anyway, so they're just endless.
Endless. Okay. At some points in the book, this is from Helen B. in Trenton, New Jersey. At some points in the book, notably when you discussed the reckless pollution of farm villages by state-owned and private industries, quoting others and making statements yourself, it sounds like the USA is any better at making and enforcing environmental regulations. But we know entire US communities have been poisoned by corporate harm. And how could anyone in the USA ever possibly influence what happens in China when the US is just as bad a polluter? Is it even hopeless to try for US activists?
Well, I think there's no doubt that there is horrible pollution in the United States, and I talked about the pollution of just one river, the Hudson River, right near me, from the GE plant upstate, and the kind of basic impossibility of cleaning up the Hudson River. This is decades of pollution. They stopped polluting back in the 1960s or so, and they still can't clean up the pollution. That's just from one factory. And China, unfortunately, has thousands of such factories along the river. So, it's really, this is just a horrific crisis for future generations of Chinese and for the world. It's just, it's just criminal. It's so criminal. You can shut down the coal-fired power plants tomorrow and stop the air pollution, but you can't shut down water pollution. You can't do away with that. Once the damage is done, it's done, and you really can't. And the soil pollution, there's a slab of soil in China as large as Belgium. Millions of square hectares that are just been officially declared too toxic to farm. And we know that there's a lot more than that are very bad, and that's just what they've declared. So these are huge, these are really, really huge, difficult problems that the generations are going to have to deal with. And American corporations who are complicit in this, and Western corporations in general who went there to bring their toxic industries there because they were driven out of the United States because of anti-toxic regulations, definitely owe them big time. They should by all means be forced to contribute every way they can in the cleanup of this. This is just a humanitarian crisis that happened when American industries were offshored to China. It wasn't just the cheap labor, it was also the fact they had no EPA, no OSHA, no NIOSH, none of these. So they were just free to pollute. So the dirtiest industries migrated to China right away, and they just despoiled the environment. So it's just thousands of them. Where do you start?
Your book makes that so stark and so terrifying. You really can't wrap your head around it. It's really hard for, another question here is similar. Well, it elaborates on it. It's hard for someone who's never been to China to even comprehend these things, but also the disparity between individual lives. You talk about millions of people virtually enslaved to the authoritarian state, and also about millions of nouveau riche. How do these people live side by side? Do they have access to the same information as one another?
Well, of course, the rich have their access to everything. They can get whatever media, whatever information they want. To the extent that things are available, yeah. But most people can't. My friends when I was there, I used VPNs to get outside to get news outside. But you can't use them anymore; they're all shut down. Virtual private networks for internet, but my friends in Shanghai say they're all shut down. You can't do it now. So it's very, very hard. Yeah, but the problem is that the more Xi Jinping clamps down to solidify his control over every last aspect of people's daily life, the more he alienates people doing that. You think that, the impression you get is everybody is patriotic, they love the Communist Party, love the country kind of thing. You see the banners everywhere, love the Communist Party, love the country, blah, blah, blah. But, when these things break open, suddenly you get masses of people who didn't aren't thinking that way. Why is that? So we'll see. We'll see.
We have time for another couple questions. We've gotten several questions along the same lines again. How is the growing US antagonism to China, the new Cold War, likely to shape China's response to international demands for action to stop climate change? And along the same lines, some progressive, Linda Ray asks, mentions that some progressive groups are concerned about the bashing of China, especially by the United States. They make the point that China is not our enemy. How do we rightly criticize China without falling into being seen as another form of China bashing?
There's a huge difference between China and the Chinese Communist Party. I bash the Chinese Communist Party a lot. Not enough, but a lot. But I don't bash China. The Chinese people are not responsible for a system that they did not set up. In my book, I never bash the Chinese people or China. I bash the Chinese Communist Party, deservedly so, for its crimes against humanity and against the environment, against the planet, you know? So I think you just have to make a distinction between, the fact is that the Chinese Communist Party has its own reasons for being hostile to the world and causing all kinds of problems, just like Donald Trump does. And I have to say, I am constantly struck by the parallels between Xi Jinping and Donald Trump. It's almost like they play from the same playbook, you know? They both are milking nationalism for all it's worth, you know? They all patriotic, oh, they blame each other for all their problems, you know? I mean, you know, Xi Jinping blames Donald Trump for trying to hold China back, but I think I said in one comment there in the book that Xi Jinping doesn't need help holding China back. The Communist Party has been holding China back for 7 decades, all by itself without any problem. So it's got its own dynamic, its own reasons, and we have plenty of reason to oppose the Chinese Communist Party, but not China. And America, the politicians, Trump and these people are shameless. I mean, they're just so horrible, you know, like cutting visas for Chinese students and scientists and stuff. This is so shamelessly, so horrible, you know, it's just so disgusting. And people just ought to be completely opposed to this. You know, I'm sure, you know, I'm sure that they're, on the other hand, they're true that, you know, as I quoted this commentator, opinion writer column in the New York Times, Li Yuan, who said about Huawei that they, I don't know what page it was. Anyway, he said Huawei was paying its staff who work in foreign companies to steal their IP and tech secrets, and giving them a bonus for that. And so Li Yuan said, you know, it's Xi Jinping wants to turn the Chinese into a nation of patriotic tech thieves. I mean, that's so disgusting, you know, for him to do that. And it's just like it's just like Donald Trump, you know. These people they're mere images of each other, you know. These nationalists, they're so disgusting. Anyway, there are plenty of reasons to oppose both of these people, but no reasons to oppose the China per se and the people of China. I don't know if that answers their question.
Well, you know, on the other hand, there's a question here that's kind of the opposite. Won't developing nations look to China as a leader because of all the new glossy stuff that's all over the place and looked emulated for its new cities and its material wealth? Is that a danger?
No, the Chinese have gone to Africa and they built some decent infrastructure. And you have to say, you know, like many years ago when I traveled across Africa and I was in Niger, and Central West Africa and in former British colonies, I looked around and I said, what the hell did these imperialists do all this? They didn't build anything at all here. It's you know, people, I mean, walking around with goats and camels, you know, they have no industry, no built up cities, no modern technology, nothing. For all the 100 years of imperial domination, what did they do? So here the Chinese come along, they build them a railroad, thank you very much. And they build, you know, they build lots of good infrastructure, and they also build a lot of nonsense, you know, like sports stadiums and places they don't have the sports or don't have enough people to fill them, and, you know, lots of palaces for corrupt dictators and so forth like that. But they're investing in infrastructure, building stuff that the imperial powers should have built but never did. So it's hardly surprising that, and they give them loans for that. Of course, they give them loans that are not, you know, conditioned on their political correctness, that they're not corrupt or anything. You know, like they don't care about that. Whereas the IMF and so forth believe in a different kind of corruption, but they, you know, for their loans. But anyway, they invest in these countries and give them some infrastructure, and so, you know, there are some problems with it, but by and large they're doing some good work there. That it's not surprising that people would look to China. On the other hand, China's model of totalitarian dictatorship is not being exported. Nobody really wants this. I mean, local dictators in Africa want a dictatorship, but they, you know, nobody is completely suppressing the press and completely, you know, China's Stalinist police state is not being replicated across the world. I don't think anybody wants that particularly.
And as you point out, they've deforested entire nations.
They're what?
That you said deforested entire nations. You said Indonesia's forest.
Yeah, well, I mean, part of the problem is that, okay, it's true, while they're building some decent infrastructure, they're also looting these places, you know, like the imperialists did before. You know, they're annihilating forests and, you know, New Guinea, for Christ's sake, you know, or Mozambique and all over Africa, you know, because they've got these industries that consume wood like crazy, lumber and furniture and flooring and whatnot, you know, construction and so forth. So they import a lot of lumber. They're the world's largest importer of lumber.
Well, Richard, we have a number of questions that are going to have to remain unanswered, although I'd like to forward them to you, and maybe you could
yeah, you could do that, sure, by all means.
Or, respond to
yeah.
There's one last question that I don't want to leave without asking, which is, will your book ever be translated into any Chinese languages, or will it ever see the light of day in China? What do you think?
I don't know. I talked to Jenny about trying to get a Chinese translation. We should be able to get a Chinese translation. I would think so. I don't know. It doesn't seem too difficult to do, but we'll see if there's interest in this.
Well, we're certainly interested, and this has been absolutely fascinating. I recommend that everybody get a copy of the book. I've meant to put it in the chat. I haven't done it yet, but it's plutobooks.com, and I will type that in before I sign off. And thank you, everybody. Thank you, Promise,
yes.
Lee, and Richard Smith, for an absolutely riveting conversation. And thank you to everybody who's joined us today. Hope to see you again. Please get in touch with us, systemchange.climatechange.org. Like us on Facebook. Tell your friends.
Thanks, Mara. Thank you. Bye.